I feel like I say this all the time, but 1990 was a seriously good year for video games, and especially action RPGs. And a lot of the titles from the year are really well known, like Star Tropics, Quest for Glory 2, Final Fantasy III, plenty of greats. But just 1 year before the Super Nintendo was released, a development studio who's best known in the arcade world for creating the Neo Geo dropped a hidden gem on the NES. A diamond in the rough, if you will. A game called Crystalis. This game had a lot more to it than meets the eye. There's a deep, if sometimes confusing storyline, plenty of action and RPG elements, really creative graphics, and a fantastic soundtrack all at the same time. So why don't you hear about it, all the time when people talk about retro RPGs? Well, the issue, in my opinion, is that this game just had too much going on for the platform it was released on. It was held back by the NES, and I think that kept it from being the great title it could have been. But not for lack of trying. It's still held fondly in the hearts of many a gamer. It might not have everything a lot of other RPGs had at the time. It wasn't fancy and it wasn't complicated, but at least the developers thought it could be a great title. And that's why I like to call Crystalis the little RPG that could.
Nintendo video games.
Marry me with my money.
Now you're playing with power.
There have been a lot of action RPGs that got attention over the years, but it's a small list that's still highly regarded some 34 years later, and I think Crystalis is one of them. But as I said, when you look at everything it tried to be, this game really felt limited by the platform it was on. It wanted to do more and to be more, but with what the NES could do, specifically in terms of controls in this case, it ended up being a little more frustrating than it should have. But let's start with something that sure as hell wasn't limited in this game, and that's the story. Our story begins in the future, which is really the past now, but whatever. Anyhow, October 1st, 1997, also known as the End Day. The world is engulfed in a terrible war, the origins of which are mostly left to our imaginations, and civilization as we know it is destroyed. Now, 100 years later, the survivors left on Earth have begun to rebuild their lives, but left science and technology behind as it was the cause of their downfall. However, a powerful magician named Dragon decided to mix magic and technology to rule this world and shacks up in a tower in the sky to basically lord over everyone forever. In an attempt to defeat him, magicians created 4 elemental swords, which, when combined, would make the ultimate weapon known as Crystalis. But those swords are hidden all around the world and they're basically lost to memory. So when the game proper begins, you find yourself awakening with no memory, and as you go through the various areas, towns, and many caves, you meet the 4 powerful magicians who made the swords who guide you on your way. You also find out that you're basically the chosen one who was frozen away at the end of the Great War and are destined to save the world from Dragon, with the help of the swords and their accompanying jewelry items. There's also a girl named Messia involved, another survivor from your time, but what she actually does to help things along kinda confused me if I'm honest. Anyhow, in the end, you'll face many of Dragon's underlings in battle, and eventually confront Dragon himself. But even once he's defeated, you still have to enter the Sky Tower up there and put an end to the magic supercomputer Dragon built in order to finally save the Earth. All in all, it's a pretty deep plot, and while I'm glad it's there, and I think it provides a lot of structure to the game, it feels like it was really overwritten once you play through it. There's a lot of exposition crammed into the otherwise mostly action elements of the game. I don't know, it just felt like it never really got a chance to fully explain itself before you wrap things up. The gameplay, however, is where Crystalis really outdid itself. When I said there's a lot to the plot, you might have thought I was kidding, so let me be really clear on this. When it comes to the gameplay, there's a ton to it. Not so much the basic mechanics, that we'll cover pretty quickly, but if you intend to actually beat Crystalis, you're going to spend some time figuring things out, because a lot of what you need to do is left, well, vague as hell. For starters, pretty much the whole game is from a top-down perspective. For movement, you can move in 8 directions using the control pad, which is nice. Not a lot of RPGs let you move diagonally back then. Being on the NES, you only have 2 buttons. One you use to swing or charge whatever sword you have equipped at the moment. The other switches between casting equipped spells, using equipped healing items, or other items like boots that let you jump. The start and select button are where things get a little nutty, because start pulls up your status screen and select for your inventory, but it's only in the inventory that you can then hit start and get to a save screen. It honestly might take you a minute to figure out that it's there, and you're going to want to because the average playtime in this thing is like 9 hours. And since I'm talking about the menu screen, you'll be seeing it a lot too. See, in Crystalis, you collect those 4 swords I mentioned in the plot as you progress, each tied to a different element: wind, fire, water, and thunder. The rub there, though, is that the different monsters are vulnerable to different swords and their elements, which also means they're invulnerable to the others. So right out of the gate, when you get your first sword, you quickly realize not everyone's going to get hurt when you hit them with it. But I also mentioned there are jewelry items that go with the swords, which you'll have to collect as well. There are elemental balls and bracelets for each sword, and each brings a different charge-up capability to your sword's attacks. Some enemies and obstacles are only vulnerable to the charged versions of your sword's swing, so you gotta figure that out as well. You'll also learn magic spells as you go along, including one that heals and another that creates a shield around you. These aren't cast once and get the effect spells either. You have to press the button the entire time you want to use it. Now, why does all this matter to the gameplay? Well, because you only have one button for everything that isn't your sword. You can only equip one item or power at a time. And you also have to manually equip the right sword and its corresponding jewelry at different times for different reasons. Like I said, you're going to have to go to the menu screen a ton because this stuff happens in the middle of fights basically non-stop. This is also a good point to mention that when you're facing bosses, they also have weaknesses to some elements and are resistant to others. But that's not all. No. Even if you have the right sword, you also have to be at a high enough level in order to do them any harm. And there's nothing to tell you that. You just have to kind of keep trying. I don't know, that just seems savage to me. And since we're on the subject of enemies, I should also point out that many of the later game bad guys have projectiles with status effects like poison, turning you to stone, or stopping you from using the charging powers of your swords. Tough, but I can get that. Except there are some moments where you need those powers to progress, and the status ailments need items or powers to remedy them. So many times if you're out of those and you're paralyzed, you end up having to either backtrack forever to get back to a town, or just dying and starting back from your last checkpoint or save. I know a lot of RPGs had elements like this, but most of them eventually ended in death, not requiring a suicide to keep the game moving. Grinding for XP is a part of almost every RPG, and I don't see that as a bad thing. In this game, you actually end up grinding for money more though, because while you do learn useful spells throughout the game, your MP never really catches up with them, so you run out really fast. And items are the only way to heal or keep that magic replenished when it dries up, aside from staying at the inn. The problem is, there aren't many descriptions available for the items themselves, at least if you played this game without reading the manual, which I definitely did the first time. For example, early on you can buy an item called Magic Ring, which, at least to me, could be an attack, or it could be to replenish your magic, but you only find out by buying one and trying it out. And that costs a lot of money. Buying items gets exponentially more expensive as you go through different towns. Again, not unlike most RPGs, but fortunately you learn a spell pretty early that lets you go back to any previously visited town. That's a special kind of grace I appreciated, because walking all the way back to get a deal somewhere else would be a huge issue. I should also mention that dialogue can also be super quick, and though most of the NPCs just say silly things that you can ignore, some are giving you clues to quests, and that's easy to miss. Not only are messages initiated by just bumping into people, so walking through towns, for example, can trigger a ton of them and you get used to skipping through them to keep moving, but I personally also just accidentally tapped a button a couple of times and missed important story elements altogether. All this probably sounds like I'm complaining about the gameplay in Crystalis, and yeah, I guess there are some gripes I have about it, but I also really enjoyed a lot of how the game was played. At the time Crystalis came out, things were changing in a big way in video games, and the older RPGs were really slow, where Crystalis was snappy and felt quick. And because the gameplay was moving so fast, there were times where it felt like the NES and its abilities just couldn't keep up. At first blush, you'd be forgiven if you said the graphics in Crystalis weren't exactly stellar. I can see that, especially when you look at things through the lens of what the SNES brought just a little while later. But what I see in Crystalis is less a stellar execution of graphics capabilities and more a creative departure from what came to feel a little formulaic with RPGs in the 90s, especially on the NES. Everything in those games generally felt very square, very grid-like, and Crystalis never did. Each area you explore has its own unique feel to it. There are different environmental obstacles to overcome in each and different enemies to face. And that's nice to see, given how common it was for games to just repeat the same enemy over and over with different colors at the time. The towns all have a different design, and in general the people are all a little different. The stores are the same, but that's a super small thing to worry about. Now, for all the effort they put into making each overworld area and town feel unique, the caves themselves, which is where you spend most of your time in my experience, are pretty much the same design over and over. That's not so much a complaint as a missed opportunity, since there's so much in Crystalis that you can see the developers spent time thinking about. There were also some parts of the game where the graphics just clipped here and there. It was unavoidable because the game moves really quickly and the NES wasn't great at handling that kind of speed. And some parts of the levels, especially the tower near the end of the game, well, you could tell the developers wanted to make it more than it turned out to be. All that aside, I think the graphics brought a lot to Crystalis. The game also had a really good soundtrack that never got too drony or repetitive even when you were grinding for money or experience for a while. I'm not sure if the chips used to make the music in this game were unique to this title, but it certainly seems that way now. The songs also have a good progression through the game. In the intro scene, they're ominous and foreboding, but the world areas are energetic and jaunty. There were admittedly a few caves where the music started getting to me, but that might be because the caves themselves were getting to me and my brain confused the signals or something. Near the end, as the science and technology sort of creep their way back into the story, the music also sort of adapts to that. And I think in general, the soundtrack to Crystalis helped to carry the game along really well. So what have we learned today? Well, first of all, I think Crystalis is a really good example of a development team having big, expansive, creative ideas that they wanted to bring to the home console, but were limited by the hardware itself. I don't think that makes Crystalis a bad game by any measure, but it also makes me kind of wish they'd taken another crack at it on a newer console down the road. I do know the game was released a full decade later on the Game Boy Color, but from what I've read, the port was such a departure from the original that it wasn't received very well. I did also hear the game got a release on the Nintendo Switch in an SNK Greatest Hits title, but I never played it, so I can't vouch for it being a good version. I just know there hasn't been a rendition done of this great game that allows it to be what I think it always wanted to be. I highly suggest you give this game a play. I think you're going to have a good time. I know I did. And I know that I called this the little RPG that could in the beginning, but really I like to think of it as the little action RPG that did. Whatever, I get to be cheesy. Anyhow, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.